All right, tonight we're going to be starting the 4th chapter, We Agnostics, and that begins on page 44 in your big book. Before we get into the reading of chapter 4, let's consider briefly what we're doing here. Now, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we were studying the 3rd chapter. Remember, we found that the 3rd chapter is really split into 2 parts. The first part of the 3rd chapter deals almost exclusively with first step material, because the point of that part of the chapter is to deal with our alcoholism and how we tried to stop and couldn't do it. And of course, the definition of the first step is found there. And then, in the second part of the 3rd chapter, we got into the stories of Bill and Jim and the jaywalker, and also the guy who was sober for 25 years and then drank again and was gone within a few years. And we found that there was a specific purpose in that last part of the 3rd chapter, in that it clearly illustrated with real life people and also with an allegory the insanity of alcoholism, the insanity of that first drink. Talking about those strange mental blank spots. Talking about our total inability to control the obsession, compulsion to drink if it hits us. That we can't do that on our own. The willpower is utterly insufficient to do that. This is a very important part of the consideration of the second step. Now, most people feel that chapter 4 encompasses the basic ideas of the second step in the big book, and yet we find that most assuredly the last part of the 3rd chapter also addresses many of the concerns. For example, if you're new and somebody is talking to you, or you're reading the second step and you're saying, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And we want to balk at that. We want to say, what's this business of insanity? I'm not insane. I just drank too much. And sure, I had moments of insanity, but I've already chalked them up to the alcohol. Because the people down at the treatment center told me that was why I was insane, because I was drunk. What they didn't tell you, my dear friend, is that you were drunk because you were insane. And that insanity is one of the hallmarks of the disease of alcoholism. It's one of the hallmarks of being buried in self. And we are now on the verge of being required by the working of our 12 steps to begin to take responsibility for ourselves. Take responsibility for what happened to us. To see that we are the product of a selfish, self-centered, self-seeking, self-pitying mind. That we've been making decisions based on self, which have placed us in a position to be hurt. And so the 3rd chapter was clearly illustrating to us the insanity of taking the next drink in spite of the fact that we knew without any doubt whatsoever that the results are going to be horrible. We'd had examples of this over and over and over again. We had pledged ourselves to quit. We had promised to quit. We had gone to God to quit. We'd gone to our loved ones and promised them and begged on our knees to be taken back, and we were going to quit. We wanted to stop. We wanted to stop, but we could not, because we're powerless over that first drink. And so we saw the insanity. Now, in chapter 4, we're going to be looking at that part of the big book which addresses the very problem that we've got when we get here. Most of us, at the very least, have turned away from God, and most certainly are. When we come in, we're spiritually bankrupt. Our spiritual bankruptcy is, in general terms, is the result of our being blocked off from God. We're blocked from the sunlight of the Spirit. We may believe in God, but we haven't been able to reach out to Him. And we've been utterly frustrated by our inability. to be in close and conscious contact with our higher power. Now, this was the situation with Bill Wilson. And a little bit of history here is instructive because it will help us to understand why this chapter was written and what is the historical background of it. When Bill, and we read about this and shared this together when we read Bill's story, but let's refresh our memories. On that November night when Bill Wilson was sitting in his kitchen and his wife was working and he was trying to figure out if he had enough gin to get through the night, and he was drinking, and Ebby called him, his friend Ebby called him and said he was in town and could he come over. That night was the pivot point for all of us because it was on that very night that Ebby showed up sober. And Bill was willing to listen to Ebby. And when we read Bill's story, we find that as a result of Bill being willing to listen and to believe what Ebby was telling him, that Bill was able to take his first step. And then a little bit later, his second step. Remember what Ebby said to him, Bill, you can choose your own conception of God. You don't have to take the God of the Oxford group or anybody's God. Choose your own conception. And that set Bill free. And then Ebby said to him, Bill, it's only necessary that you be willing to believe that there just might be a power out there greater than yourself. And that willingness is everything. Now we're going to find when we read chapter 4 that that same admonition is repeated 4 times. We ought to be sure that it sinks in. Now what was going on with Bill is very instructive because Bill believed that there probably was some great power out there which was responsible for the universe, maybe kept all the planets and stars and stuff in line. But he could not believe, refused to believe that there might be this power, this God who would have an interest personally in each individual human being. He could not believe in a God personal to him. He refused to accept the possibility that this might be so. Now this is, I suppose you could call a form of agnosticism, but certainly it is totally anti any possibility of any close connection with God. It leaves God clear out here running the universe, and it leaves us sitting here trying to run our own lives, and we've already found out we can't do that. But when Ebby came and talked to Bill and he showed him what was happening in his life, and Bill began to look closely at what was happening, and he believed Ebby. He believed him because he knew him well. He was an old friend, and he knew that Ebby was a dead drunk, but he was also not a liar. So Bill wanted what Ebby had, and he was willing to listen. And because of that, and because Bill was willing to accept the possibility that there just might be a personal God out there, something happened with him. Now he wrote extensively about this, but let's just take a look at something. If you have Language of the Heart, you can turn to page 245. Page 245, the fourth paragraph. None of Ebby's ideas were really new. Bill's talking about that Ebby was telling him about this higher power he'd found, this God that would set him free. None of Ebby's ideas were really new. I'd heard them all before, but coming over his powerful transmission line, they were not at all what in other circumstances I would have regarded as conventional cliché for good church behavior. They appeared to me as living truths which might liberate me as they had liberated him. He could reach me at depth. Now, remember Dr. Silkworth borrowed that phrase in his opinion when we were back there reading Doctor's Opinion. Remember he said that the message which can interest these alcoholic people cannot be a frothy emotional appeal. It must have depth and weight. And so Bill is saying here that Ebby was able to reach him at depth. In one respect, I still backed away. I could not go for God because I could not believe there was any God. Ebby sold me his other ideas at once, but not this one. I could not share his faith as much as I had to admit its very evident result. I had struck an impasse which thousands of incoming AAs have since collided. Mine was exactly the kind of deep-seated block we so often see today in new people who say they are atheistic or agnostic. Their will to disbelieve is so powerful that apparently they prefer a date with the undertaker to an open-minded and experimental quest for God. And that's true. There's so many who just are not going to be willing to even take a try. Happily for me and for most of my kind who have since come along in AA, the constructive forces brought to bear in our fellowship. Thank you, God. All right. In our fellowship have nearly always overcome this colossal obstinacy. I think God is saying, Bill, wait a second, this fellowship didn't do it, I did it. Pay attention, fella. Beaten into complete defeat by alcohol, confronted by the living proof of release, and surrounded by those who can speak to us from the heart, we have finally surrendered. And then, paradoxically, we found ourselves in a new dimension, the real world of spirit and of faith. Enough willingness, enough open-mindedness, and there it is. When my own time for open-mindedness and surrender finally came, that new world of spirit burst upon me in a flash of overwhelming conviction and power. And as a result, freedom from obsession, faith in God, and a consciousness of His presence have remained with me ever since, regardless of subsequent ups and downs. The gift of faith instantaneously became built into me. My pride had paid a very high price. In despair, I had cried out. Now I am willing to do anything. If there is a God, will He show Himself? And He did. This was my first conscious contact, my first awakening. I asked from the heart, and I received. And Bill, to the end of his days, maintained that epiphany, that major spiritual awakening, spiritual experience stayed with him all the rest of his life. Now then, this isn't going to happen for all of us. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, in Bill's story, he made sure we understand that, and I think it's important for us to recall that, because there's a lot of talk about, there's a lot of talk and some dispute about this business of having this necessity of having this major spiritual experience in order to recover, and certainly that is not so. Now let's go, oh wait a minute, I got in the wrong place here. Okay, we're going to find it, bear with me here. Okay. If you look at page 14, please, in Bill's story. And there's a paragraph, second paragraph on that page, which alludes to Bill's epiphany, this major spiritual experience he had. Let's hear what he said now. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory, followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. Now here's the rule, guys, and this is the thing we must keep in mind. God comes to most men gradually. but his impact on me was sudden and profound. And we're going to see that same thing repeated several more times as we go through the book. There is no question about it. The big book is clear that it is not necessary to have a bright light or burning bush experience in order to recover. And there ought to be no confusion about that. These epiphanies are rare. Once in a while they happen. I only know a few people in all the time I've been around who are willing to acknowledge that this is what happened to them. And so now we have Bill, having had his spiritual awakening, the second step came to him. Now we need to look to see what we need to know in order to help us overcome our agnosticism or atheism, if that's our problem, or to help others who may have that problem. We're going to turn now to page 44. The chapter, We Agnostics. This is one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in any literature anywhere. It is utterly spiritual. It is dramatic. It tells us the truth. It states many truths which we would think would be self-evident, and yet they're not. It boldly steps forth and says, this is the way it really is, guys. And it gives a lie to those around here who would have us believe that we're not supposed to talk to anybody about God when they're new. We might scare them away. The big book is just the opposite, and there's a very good reason for that. If I'm working with you or speaking with you and you're brand new, and you're looking for an answer, and you're sick, sore, and wounded, and you've been torn to pieces by booze and by life and everything, and you're feeling as if you cannot possibly hold on for another day. Now here you are, and you're looking for answers. And so I'm going to tell you about myself. I'm going to tell you how I drank and what alcohol did to me and how I tried to stop and couldn't. And I'm going to hope that you'll be able to identify in some way with me, and that I can create with you some credibility, that you'll be willing to listen to me. And I'm going to tell you about the disease and how deadly it is, so that perhaps you can begin to see whether you're one of us or not. And then finally, if you're still interested, I'm going to tell you how I recovered. And the big book instructs me specifically to stress the spiritual freely. Over and over again, in everything that we read in this book, God is right up front. Look at the steps, right up front there in the second step, all the way through. By the way, when Bill wrote the steps down, he was surprised, he says, to find God right up there in the front. But yet that's the way it is, because this program is a spiritual program. It is God-dependent, as we must become God-dependent. And to say anything else is a lie. If I'm going to tell you how I recovered and I don't tell you about my higher power, about the grace which has been given me, if I don't tell you about my powerlessness and the only power I have, which allowed me to withstand the ravages of alcoholism and all the other things and vicissitudes of life, and I don't tell you about God, I've lied to you. What am I supposed to substitute for that? Group therapy? Or medication? Encounter groups? Psychiatrist couch? Outpatient? No. If I'm telling you the truth, I'm telling you that I have found a spiritual way of life. And I found that by working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've gone from a place of rebellion and defiance and denial to a place of surrender and obedience to a higher power of my own choosing. And that this is what has worked for me. We're going to find that the big book is entirely consistent in this. It never once varies. So we don't want to lie to people about how we recovered. We want to tell them the truth. And in telling them the truth, we're going to be talking about God, just as the big book does right from the get-go. Never once does it waver from the same same message over and over again. From the time Bill said back in his story that I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all, the Big Book never varies from that message. Not once. Why? Because that's our program. Our recovery is dependent upon that. So let's go to page 44 and see what it says. Chapter 4, We Agnostics. In the preceding chapters, you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. That's a flat statement, isn't it? Are there any equivocation there? Any weasel words that you can see? Any out clauses? No. You will be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, remember, we've talked about this before. Wherever you see Bill talking about spiritual experiences, he writes this book. That was translated at the time the 12th step was changed by the editorial board to spiritual awakening. But it means exactly the same thing. You're going to have a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps. And here Bill says, the Big Book says that only a spiritual experience, in other words, a spiritual awakening will conquer this illness. To one who feels he's an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed, here's the dilemma, to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. We talked about this in the workshop this afternoon. People walking in that door, so many of them are scared to death of sobriety. They have a huge fear of being sober. And that fear is a mix of many things. For one thing, being sober means no more whiskey, no more beer, and no more any other funny stuff that bends our minds and allows us to escape from reality. And how am I going to survive without that? It also means that I'm going to have to start accepting responsibility for my life, and I'm going to have to live up to my commitment. And I have to throw away all the excuses I've been given for my crapped out behavior. I can no longer live by the maxim that I'm not responsible because I had a dysfunctional family. Or that somewhere back there I bottled up my feelings, and I never knew I was entitled to my feelings, and I never knew that if I didn't talk about my feelings I was going to drink. I didn't know that I was only as sick as my secrets. I didn't know that I was not responsible, that my good psychiatrist friends out there could find every reason in the world why I would do these crappy things that had nothing to do with me. I don't want to give that up. And here you guys come along, you tell me I have a disease. I say, aha, you see? I'm sick. No wonder I did all that stuff. I'm not responsible. And then our sponsor comes along and the Big Book comes along and says, whoa, wait a second, that's not at all what we mean. Powerlessness doesn't mean you are powerless over your actions, will be. It means you are powerless over your thinking. And you've been taking wrong action all along, knowing damn well it was wrong. Saying, oh, well, I'll do it anyway. I'd like to think that we didn't have responsibility. But here now, if I get sober and I'm required to be constantly abstinent, I can no longer dive into the bottle and drown all my cares and worries and disappear from life. what in the world am I going to do? I'm scared to death of this sobriety stuff. And many times this will add up to a rejection of the whole ideas, all the ideas that are encompassed by a spiritual way of life. And if we're helping somebody like that, we need to show them by our actions, by the way we live our lives, that it's a wonderful way of life, and it is not anything to be afraid of. And most especially that once we have embraced that way of life, we will be blessed with God's power in our lives. We will be enabled to do those things which we need to do, to take responsibility for ourselves. And God will be there with us and help us. And we can show that to these new people. Looky here, I was just like you, but I've had a spiritual awakening. And I get everything I need, and I stay close to God, and then I need something, and I need strength, and I need courage. I turn to Him, and I always get it. You don't have to be afraid anymore. We tell them that. We were looking at the fear of sobriety, which is a very, very real and powerful fear, and not too often recognized. Keep in mind now that we are on the threshold here of the second step, that we're to come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Another step does not say will restore us to sanity, but can or could. It's kind of interesting, I think, we get into the next chapter and we read this at almost every meeting, the third pertinent idea. That we're alcoholics and can't manage our own lives, that no human power can relieve us of our alcoholism, but that God can and will, if we seek Him. So we progress from could to can, and that, of course, is the truth. Then going on down on page 44, but it isn't so difficult, this business of having to choose. About half our original fellowship were exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life, or else. Now, there are two places in the Big Book where these two ideas are mated. Must and or else. I'm going to show you the other one because this is important for us to understand what must means in this book. Take a look at page 72, please. Where did I'm having another senior moment here. Where is it? Where is it? Never mind, I can't find it. Let's go back. Mea culpa, mea culpa.
Bottom of page 73, Jim.
70, oh, okay. All right, let's go. Thank you. I knew it was around here somewhere. Thank you. Back to 73. If we keep doing this, you're going to learn where all of your stuff is here. Okay, oh, this must down here. We must be entirely honest with somebody if we expect to live long or happily in this world. Now, mating of the two phrases, must and or else, tells us what must means. There are something around 62, 63, 64 musts in the Big Book. And every one of them means the same thing. We must or else. Now, what is the or else? The or else is to die an alcoholic death. That's exactly what it means. Now remember that when this book was written, it was written to show you and me precisely how the first people in this fellowship had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And they'd come to certain basic understandings, and there were certain things that they must do, and they pass that along to us, and they say, okay guys, these are things that you must do. These are categorical imperatives. These are absolutes. And every time we hear chapter 5 being read, we got to listen to what it's saying. There's no equivocation there. There's no weasel words, there's no backing away, there's no out clauses, no nothing. It's just flat out, this is what you gotta do. Going on, perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Now this next paragraph is one of the more important paragraphs. The next three paragraphs, some of the most important stuff in this whole big book. Because this lays the groundwork and it establishes for us the basics. And I'm telling you that I learned a long time ago there's only one way to continue to work this program, and that is to continuously go back to the basics. Otherwise you get lost in all the falderall out there. All this stuff that comes floating around that really has nothing whatsoever to do with recovery, and it sounds pretty good. In fact, we got a whole book. There used to be, well, it was here at the last meeting. There's a book called Living Sober, which is nothing but falderall. Doesn't have anything to do with the big book or the steps, and it's all human solution stuff. And the problem is it doesn't deal with the basics of what's wrong with us and what we must do in order to recover. Let's see what this says. Bottom of page 44. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. A code of morals, a better philosophy of life are insufficient. If they had been sufficient, many of us would have recovered long ago. And this is true. There are lots and lots of people, maybe everybody in this room, wish to be moral, wish to have a better philosophy, wish to follow moral and ethical principles, but we found that we could not stay sober, even though we wanted to. But we found that such codes and philosophy did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Now here's the basic thing. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Isn't that a beautiful definition of powerlessness? You see, that's what we always have to come back to. Why am I here? I'm here because I cannot stop drinking on my own. It doesn't make any difference how many times I'm told that I must not take another drink. Doesn't matter how many times I've been told not to drink and go to meetings and you'll be just fine. If you just don't drink, your whole life will change, and on and on and on, the same old sorry story. And nobody wants to tell us how you go about doing that. If I have no power to stop drinking on my own, how do I go about it? Well, let's see, the next paragraph. Lack of power, of course, that's what we're talking about here. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live. Notice that's as opposed to die. A power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Please notice that the word power is capitalized. That means that we are talking about a deity here. We are not talking about an ashtray, doorknob, AA group, or pickup truck. We're talking about a deity. That's why the word power is capitalized. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. By the way, has anyone in here ever seen anybody get down on their knees and pray to an AA group, or a doorknob, or an ashtray, or a pickup truck? I would be amazed if anybody said, yes, I've seen that happen. Or how about just praying to the group without getting down on our knees? You see, we can get down that blind alley, and before we know it, we're buried in something which is utterly unworkable. It has nothing whatsoever to do with recovery. We must find a power greater than ourselves, obviously, but where and how were we to find this power? That's the problem. Here's the solution. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Now, that's just an absolutely flat statement, isn't it? That if we find a power greater than ourselves and surrender to that power, our problem will be solved. Let's take a look on page 85. By the time we get to the 10th step, let's see what's happened. It's all here. Page 85. Let's go to about 10 lines down from the top of page 85. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. That's because the big book never once says don't drink. It says find God. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. See that? And when this tells us back here on page 45 that we need to find a power which will solve our problem, and we do that by following the directions in this book. The basics of everything then comes back to this. We're powerless over alcohol. We're powerless over our thinking. We cannot direct in our lives ourselves. We have to quit playing God. We've got to put a power greater than ourselves in our lives if we expect to recover. Period. 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 And if that power greater than ourselves is not there, we do not recover. And when we are still blocked off from God, we do not recover, and therefore we have to find out what it is that's blocking us and with God's help be freed from those things so that we can recover. Remember, by the time we get to the 10th step and the problem has been removed, what's happened? We've done our 4th step, we found out what the problems are, we found out what blocks us from God. In our 5th step, we've admitted all of that. In our 6th and 7th step, we've asked God to take away those things that block us from Him. In our 9th step, we have taken care of the guilt, remorse, and shame, which also blocks us from God, and we've done this with God's help and through His grace. And now when we reach our 10th step, we've entered the world of the Spirit, we've become God conscious, we've been restored to sanity, and the problem's been solved. See, these are all basic things, and this is what we have to concentrate on. If we get lost in the woods of all the psychobabble and the human solution stuff that floats around here, we may never get to a point where we, in fact, can recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So it all goes back to powerlessness. I was talking to somebody today, and they were reciting to me some things which were happening in their life. And they were very angry and didn't know why. And I said to them, take a look at this. You feel powerless. And powerlessness always leads us back to fear, and fear leads us to anger, and anger to resentment. You can count on it. Let's go on now. Page 45, the second full paragraph. We got to find a power that will solve our problem. That means that we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. There's no weasel word there, no equivocation there. This big book talks about God. Why is it that we insist, some of us, that we must not do that? That we just might scare somebody off, or we might come off sounding as if we were sort of spiritually elite, or that kind of stuff. And so we talk all the way around it, and yet we're not willing to just flatly say my sobriety is dependent entirely upon my surrender to the God of my understanding. Period. Because that's the truth. Here difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. but his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. Now notice that this is not saying that most of the people who come in here are in fact confirmed agnostics or atheists. That's not true. Most people who have their doubts about God are doubting for other reasons, not because they have intellectually determined or been convinced that God does not exist. The problem is guilt, and the problem is fear. And it may very well be that the person who is the most afraid of and distrustful of the idea of God is the person who has been carefully taught all their lives that they can't trust God because he's going to clobber them the minute they get out of line. I'm not saying that that's not true, because heck, I don't know. But I know that it causes enormous amounts of overwhelming fear, and it stalls people in their tracks. What's the use, they say? I've already committed all these sins. I'm already doomed. I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't even want to think about God. I don't want him in my life. I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid of his justice. I'm afraid of his punishment. The more I think about it and the more I concentrate on that, the more I have to drink to try to get rid of it. Don't talk to me about God, because I'm afraid and I feel guilty. And so, what the Big Book tells us, that we have been we thought we had neatly evaded or entirely ignored the idea of God. Only thought we had. Because we're going to find out now as we continue to read this chapter that that's simply not true. That he's always been there, and most of us have always known it. We know it. We may not have been concentrating on the idea of God. We may not have consciously been aware or that we believed, but deep down inside of us we have known. Because God is of us and we're of him. God is spirit, we're spirit. He's of us, we are of him. He's there. That's the truth. Going on, now, we know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious, but you see, that's not the same as being agnostic or atheist. Being violently anti-religious can mean simply that I am totally turned off by all established religions. Many people believe that God is way too big to fit inside any one religion. And that men who have run these religious groups have established them and fashioned them in accordance with their own predilections and their own prejudices and their own interpretations, and have ruled their religions by fear. Now, you don't believe as we believe, you're going to hell and you're going to burn forever. Well, maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. I don't pretend to know. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows except through some kind of belief system which has no proof. But nevertheless, we're talking now about the person who's coming in here and needs to get sober in order for there to be any possibility of any kind of a life from here on out. And we're telling them it's going to be necessary for you to find a power greater than yourself, the power we call God. We don't care what you call this power. We don't try to tell you what your conception of this power ought to be. We tell you to choose your own conception. And we're not telling you that you have to believe as we believe. We're telling you that you have to be willing to believe that there just might be this power. That's all that is required to get started. And we're going to read that 4 more times in this book as we get there in the next couple of pages. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We look upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claim to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments we found ourselves thinking, when enhanced by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Now this whole idea that we just read about dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was weak, even cowardly. Let's take a look at another thought along that lines over on page 68. Third full paragraph, page 68. We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. That's the third step prayer, isn't it? God, take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help with Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. And the tagline would be, working in and through me. Allow me to be an example of God's power working in my life. We go on page 46. Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. This is the first time where the Big Book has tied together the words power and God, separated by two words. That power, which is God. Now then, we're thinking now second step, aren't we? We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Where and how are we to find this power? Well, that's what this book is all about. Suppose now that you or someone you're helping or someone close to you, someone in your support group is having this trouble. And we're saying to them, to him or to her, all that is necessary is for you to be willing to believe. And they say to us, but I'm not willing. It's kind of like, well, what are you going to do about that? Well, we have an answer, don't we? They're not going to like it, but it works. What do we say to them? Pray for the willingness. What? To whom? That's the whole point, isn't it? Pray to whom it may concern.